The lesson on the Calvary Chapel Distinctives this week comes from Chapter 7, the Centrality of Jesus Christ. There are a lot of things that can happen in a church service that will draw people's attention away from Jesus Christ. Are you paying attention to me? Chuck gave several examples of things, and it's important to understand his approach to these things. Calvary Chapel is not opposed to people standing and raising their hands during worship. The issue is whether or not the church is doing it together or whether a single individual is doing it up front and drawing attention away from Jesus. This is really a call to balance. We want to grow in our worship of God, but we also need to make sure that we do it in an appropriate way. In 1 Corinthians chapters 12 through 14, the Apostle Paul is dealing with how the church should operate when it's together. In chapter 12, Paul talks about the church being like a human body, and the people in the church are like parts of the body, and we need each other, and each part has value. In chapter 13, we sometimes think this is just a whole new subject, Paul's love chapter, but it's really about the church. It's what Paul calls in chapter 12, verse 31, he calls it the more excellent way. Love is the most important thing when it comes to how the church should operate. Listen again to this familiar passage, but keep in mind, Paul is talking about getting along with others in church. He says, love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. This is how we're supposed to treat each other. And when Paul gets to chapter 14, Paul's focus is keeping the church meeting orderly. That things are organized and everything is being done to build up the people in the church. Some churches think that they're spiritual because the whole church speaks in tongues at the same time. But listen to what Paul says. He says in chapter 14, verse 23, therefore, if the whole church comes together in one place and all speak with tongues, and there come in those who are uninformed or are unbelievers, will they not say that you are out of your mind? Chuck hinted several times about how some of our behaviors might seem spiritual, but when we are in a larger meeting and there are potentially unbelievers present, we shouldn't be going out of our way to make them think that we're crazy. It's one thing to exercise gifts in smaller settings where everyone is a believer, and when we are in a larger service, we need to be mindful of the unbelievers that may be present. We don't want to hinder them from hearing about Jesus. Paul places limits on how the gifts of the Spirit should be operated. Paul recommends that when the church is together, tongues should only be allowed if there's someone with a corresponding gift of interpretation of tongues. Otherwise, the person with tongues should just pray quietly to themselves. That's in chapter 14, verse 28. Even with the gift of prophecy, Paul recommends that only one person speak at a time and to limit the number of people who speak. That's in chapter 14, verses 29 through 32. In other words, it seems that the Holy Spirit doesn't intend to interrupt himself. If the pastor is teaching his message, don't interrupt. Then Paul writes in chapter 14, verse 33, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. And then Paul goes on to say something interesting about women. He says in chapter 14, verse 34, he says, let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. Now, it almost sounds like Paul is telling the women to shut up and be quiet. What we don't realize in our American church minds is how the early church operated. They operated often under the same format as the early synagogue, with men sitting on one side of the room and women sitting on the other, if women were even allowed inside. In these ancient times, women were mostly illiterate and uneducated, especially in areas of religion. So when a woman became a Christian, it was a whole new world when she found herself welcomed into the church. Yet she would find herself in a world that she didn't know much about. And she's probably not sitting with her husband. And when the pastor says something she doesn't understand, she might yell across the room to her husband, "What does that mean?" When Paul is talking about women being silent, he's talking about them not interrupting the service. They can ask their questions at home. The shame of a woman speaking in church is the same shame of a man speaking and interrupting the church. It's all out of order. And so Paul ends the chapter with a simple overarching principle. 1 Corinthians 14:40, let all things be done decently and in order. And so it's with these principles of order in the church that Chuck addresses the subject of the person standing up in the front row waving their hands during worship. I think it's a good thing to raise your hand in worship. I think it's a good thing to stand before the Lord in worship. The problem comes when you're the only one doing it and you're sitting up in the front row. What's inevitably going to happen is that a lot of eyes are going to be drawn away from worship, and they will be drawn to that person up front, even if that person is doing it from a pure heart. If you are a person who likes to stand in worship while others might be seated, and I got to tell you, when I'm not playing my keyboard, I usually like to do that, then sit in the back of the church so you aren't a distraction when you stand up. Sometimes when a worship leader is aware of the lone person standing, they can help the person by asking the whole church to stand. If the whole church is standing, then there's no problem, unless, of course, the person is simply out to make themselves noticed. We've had all sorts of distractions over the years. I've had people come to the church with tambourines and with ribbons on sticks. We had a gal do a sort of Hawaiian hula sign language dance thing during worship time, and as beautiful as it was a little distracting from the actual worship time. In our early days of our church, we had one who wanted to bring her saw and play it like a violin with the band. We politely declined. The bigger point is about doing things decently and in order. We want our focus to be on Jesus. He needs to be front and center. I hope that helps.